The information provided is not a substitute for legal and other professional advice where the facts and circumstances warrant. People should always consult their own legal or other professional advisors and discuss the facts and circumstances that apply to their specific circumstances. The information shared on Ask the Landlord is for educational purposes only.
Hello to everyone listening out there. Happy almost spring. And we're back with another episode of Ask the Landlord with our favorite landlord, Albert Dweck. I'm Melissa. I'm one of Albert's producers and a former New York City renter. And together, we're going to be asking this landlord some questions. Hello, Albert.
Hello, Melissa.
Hello. All right, here's my question for today's episode. It's a good one. What is the difference between a rent-stabilized apartment and a rent-controlled apartment? And can you just define those terms and tell us a little bit about them?
Sure. They mean a little bit different things in different places. And I think globally, you probably want to distinguish the difference between rent-regulated apartments and free market apartments, which we can talk about. And then specifically rent-controlled versus rent stabilization. That's rent controlled, more like a New York City thing.
Mm-hmm.
So the term rent control and rent stabilization essentially are limits to what a landlord can raise rents at the expiration of a lease. Okay. And new rent control in New York City started basically in the 1920s, where there was some fear of price gouging by landlords. So the government said, for a temporary measure, so that, I think they were returning troops from World War I, maybe. The government said, we're worried about people taking advantage, and we want to make sure that people will be able to get affordable housing. So we're going to make a temporary control of rents so that, just rents won't escalate like crazy. Rent stabilization happened in a similar way, where they were returning troops really from World War II, rent control also, for the most part. And, people were worried, and it was enacted as a temporary measure to make sure that, people couldn't raise rents like crazy to take advantage of a particular situation. Now, rent control, since it predates rent stabilization, it really was a lower, meaning the rents that were much lower. And what that means is there's rules about how they can be raised. So, for example, right now, I actually have people in a building paying like $200 a month for a very large apartment.
Wow.
And those are rent control. And there's a succession in that if people lived in the apartment, kids, for a certain amount of time, whatever, they could take over that lease from their parents, right? So,
And continue paying $200?
yes. Now, the other thing is that the increases on that are set in New York by what's the rent guidelines board, which is appointed by the mayor. It's about a 9-person board that has different representatives on it, from landlords, from tenants, etc. And they say, oh, this year the rent increases are going to be X or Y. So in other municipalities in the country, there's a very few places that have rent control as a capitalized term. But you could see if someone's paying like $200 and their rent goes up 3%, it's not a lot of money. It's like $6, right? So that's how the rent stays that low. Okay. But rent control, what happens is if someone gives up a rent control apartment in New York City, it can be moved to market rent, as opposed to a rent stabilized apartment, which is the bulk of the apartments in New York City are rent stabilized. Those are basically any building that was built before 1984 and has more than 5 units was subject to rent stabilization, unless it was deregulated before the laws changed a few years ago. And generally across the country, rent, there is some sort of rent stabilization. There was in some places, like California. Oregon has statewide rent stabilization now. New York State has some where there's a restriction on how much you can raise the rent on an expiring lease for renewal. So that's and usually that's tied to CPI. So like, oh, you can only raise the rent by a CPI measure, something like that, right? So Melissa, do you have any questions? I know you're a former New York City renter, and this exists upstate also, New York, and this exists, and it happens to be going around the country. So happy to discuss it.
Let's circle back to, I think because everyone, when they hear the terms, they don't really know. I didn't know the difference between rent stabilized, rent controlled. To me, it's just, oh, this apartment is worth a lot less than it should be, right? How do I get one? Like, how do I win that lottery? And I think that's something we'll talk about. But so, like the $200 apartment, this example, right? Let's say this person is older, they pass away, they don't have kids. Does that $200 apartment stay at that price, or does it go up to $3,500 or
If
whatever
it's
it
rent
should be?
control, it comes out.
So it's not, it goes to market value.
Right. If it's rent stabilized, it doesn't.
It would stay.
Yes.
And are landlords
In
honest
New
on
York,
that?
in New York State.
In New York, is there a law that is regulating those apartments to make sure they stay affordable?
In New York State, yes. And it's not that they stay affordable. It's that they stay regulated.
Regulated. And do you not like these regulated apartments?
I think it's a short term. Yeah, so the short answer is I'm not a fan of regulation. I'm more of a free market economist kind of a guy. And I feel like what happens is, unfortunately, and there's a lot of studies done on this from all kinds of economists, and they say that, what was the point of rent stabilization it was like an emergency measure that was put in place so that people wouldn't take advantage. But then what happens is our politics are short term.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we don't elect people for more than 4 years.
Right.
We've talked about this before. So I'll just give you an example. In New York City has, let's say, 3 million households, 8.5 million people, roughly. Of the 3 million households, 2/3 of them are renters. So if you're a politician wanting to get elected in New York City, most of your constituents are renters. So you're going to pander to renters on a short-term basis. Now, I say in New York City, of the 2 million rental apartments, half of them are rent stabilized.
Wow.
So now if you're a renter in New York City and you're like half the renters in New York City rent stabilized, so now you're gonna vote for someone that's gonna sort of keep things where they are, even though that's bad for you in the long run. Now, why is that bad for you in the long run? Well, it's a short-term thing we get. Like, so let's say someone has a rent stabilized apartment. Let's say they're paying, an easier example, right, is let's say they're paying $1,000 a month and they're in an old building, right? Let's say the building's 100 years old, okay? And they've been living in this building for 20 years, okay? And the rent's $1,000. The market rent for that apartment, if it was fixed up, let's say, is $3,000, just to use a round number, and we're making up an example, okay? So now what you've done is you say, okay, look, Mr. and Mrs. Smith, you're paying $1,000. We want to keep you in that apartment because it's affordable for you, right? Makes sense in the short term. That's great. Except, so that's in the short term, yeah, you're keeping the rent at $1,000 and you're increasing it by, in New York, rent guidelines board said 3.5% increase this year, coming up in October, September, 3.5%. So basically that rent can go up $35, which is good. Except, I don't know, Melissa, I'm going to ask you a dumb question. If you're paying attention to inflation, what's the inflation rate? Is it more or less than 3% today?
I'll say more.
More. So
Okay.
basically what's happening is expenses to run the building are going up
Mm-hmm.
by more than 3%, but the rent is only going up 3% in New York. Okay. So now we have that. That's an issue, right? For the landlord, fine. But like I said, in the short term, it's good. So a person's paying $1,000, they're really just going to be paying $1,000 and it's not going to change for them. So, but what if they want to move somewhere else?
It's going to cost a lot more.
Yeah, unfortunately, by controlling the $1,000 apartment and making it so the people don't move, you're constraining supply so that the apartments that are available are more expensive.
Because there's
And the
not a lot of
apartments that the people
inventory.
are right, and the apartments the people that are in, there's no incentive for the landlord to fix them
Right. So
because
this is
the
a
landlord
bad.
can't get any more rent as a result of that.
Right. So it's a little bad. It's a bad loophole they're in.
It's a
It's like
bad.
it's a cycle.
It's good for today,
Yeah.
but in 5 years from now, in 10 years from now, these people are going to have hopefully a growing family, or they want to move, or they want to change their lifestyle, and the apartment's there, but there's no incentive to fix it. Now, in other places in California, for example, in municipalities where there are rent stabilization, rent control, when an apartment becomes vacant, so there's rent control while an apartment is occupied, right? In most cases how it works is while an apartment is occupied in most cities, right? There's a limit to what a landlord could raise the rents. Where there is rent stabilization and rent control across the country, which is not a lot of places, although it's getting more popular, there's a restriction on how much a landlord could raise the rent for an existing tenant. However, when it becomes vacant, the landlord could then raise the rent to market, but not in New York.
Not in New York.
New York State is the only state in which vacant apartments are also still regulated.
Wow. And how do you feel about that?
Yeah, so it's it's challenging. It's challenging, and it's not a free market, right? So it's like I said, in the short term, it's good for people, but really, once you get past the short term, it doesn't make a lot of sense. So, what the idea to make now your question, there's a lot. This is one of those things like Albert. How do we make housing more affordable? Right. We'll come to that, but I wanted to check in. So basically, most buildings in New York City are rent stabilized initially, right? And then if the landlord did some work prior to 2019 to get the units out of rent stabilization, they could be free market. There's, like I said, half the rentals in New York are free market. But also, I wanted to digress for a second, is that out of the 3 million apartments in New York City is 5 boroughs. So 1/3 of them are available for sale, right? So you say to yourself, why are things so expensive in New York? to buy, it's because only 1/3 of the market is available for sale. And then 1/3 is locked up in rent stabilization, which is really not coming out. And 1/3 is rentals for free markets. And those are hard to come by because the 1/3 that are for sale are not available, and the 1/3 that are rent stabilized are not available. So if you're a renter coming to New York to rent, you're saying, why is it so expensive? Well, it's expensive because you're only playing in 1/3 of the supply. Simply, right? So now, how do you fix that? Is a big question. But first, I wanted to make sure I answered the question as to what's rent stabilization, so basically it's a restriction on how much a landlord could raise the rent every year.
Mm-hmm. And is it based on the government or it's based on that board that you mentioned
So in New York
in New York?
City, it's based on the Rent Guidelines Board that meets and decides what the rent increase should be, but that has nothing to do with anything. Okay.
Mhm.
And in other municipalities, they have some CPI measure, consumer price index measure,
Okay.
where they'll say, okay, here's what inflation is. I'm going to raise it by 5% or 7%, or the CPI, whichever one is higher or lower. So this way they're keeping up with inflation.
Mm-hmm.
So and then there's some states, for example, like New Jersey. New Jersey doesn't have rent control per se. Sorry, but it hasn't. Some municipalities have it, but as on a statewide basis, you can't raise the rent unconscionably.
Mm-hmm.
So you actually have to prove to a judge that, hey, my expenses went up by this, therefore this is justified. So you can't just go crazy without oversight. Yes.
I have a question to make this a little bit more relatable because, like, a lot of renters, I'll be like, oh, why is my rent getting raised every year? And what you're addressing is inflation, right? So, if we take it to another level, like small businesses, right? Do you feel, I'm trying to think of an example of someone you use every year, like maybe a cleaner or your supers or like a maintenance person. Do they raise their prices? Do you notice
Sure.
them raising their
Sure.
prices? Is it
Well,
annually?
let's talk about that. Like you have, let's say, what's going around in the country in the last few years was minimum wage. They raised
Mhm.
minimum wage a lot. So,
Mhm.
and you see this all over. Like you can't, everyone's fully employed or whatever. Their unemployment is 3.5%, and you see advertising like $17 an hour in like a fast food restaurant, right? So
Mhm.
that means that everyone has to get paid a certain amount of money to work
Of course.
on a baseline. So that costs more to have workers.
Mhm.
So that's an increase in cost. How about, there's a war in Ukraine and Russia, and because of that, prices for utilities went up.
Mhm.
Everyone's prices for utility, gas prices went up. You know,
My
so
my mother-in-law lives in Burbank, California, and she rents, and her gas bill is usually like $20, and 2 months ago, it was almost $300.
that's what I'm
It wa
saying.
that was wild.
So what happens if a landlord is paying that bill or a tenant is paying that bill? Those are things that people have to deal with. Everything. So those things cause prices to go up, and then the costs to go up, and there's one of the myths where you're working to dispel here on Ask the Landlord is that landlords are rich or whatever it is. It's like
Right.
out of $1, landlords only make 6 cents. So on average, so one of the important things to understand is you have to keep up with inflation with your rents, as a landlord, and that basically that's what you could expect as a tenant, except when you have rent control or rent stabilization, you have the municipality says basically what the rules are, um, unless they're free market apartments. So that's the story. And then, did I answer your questions on like what rent stabilization is?
You definitely did, and I think it's also interesting to point out that I assumed it was only in New York City. So I think it's very interesting, right, that you pointed out that it's nationwide.
It's not. It's not nationwide. It's like it's as the governments across the country have gotten more progressive. The rents, it's a wave that's certainly happening where there's like people want to control
Mhm.
rents.
Right.
So certainly.
Yeah, it was very interesting. Thank you so much for answering our question.
You're welcome.
For more episodes, please subscribe to Ask the Landlord on your favorite podcast platform. We'd appreciate it if you left a review on Apple Podcasts. If you'd like to watch the show, check out our Ask the Landlord YouTube channel. If you have a question for Albert, feel free to contact him on Instagram at Ask the Landlord and check out his TikTok at Ask the Landlord. Bridging the gap between landlords and tenants, this has been Ask the Landlord. Thanks for listening.